of it, and we actually had, I recall actually having major media companies on this stage denying that they were doing any programmatic when in fact we all knew that they were. That's how far we've come in just 6 or 7 years. And one of the things that's happened, especially in the last couple of years, is publishers recognizing the way, and we heard some of this earlier this afternoon in Julian from Viacom, is publishers taking greater control of their own first-party data and being able to leverage it more effectively in the marketplace through things like private marketplaces, but also simply gaining a greater appreciation of how their audience can be leveraged more directly with media buyers. To talk about this, publishers reasserting themselves in the marketplace, reasserting their understanding and special knowledge of their audience. Taking the lead on this panel, we have Scott Denny, who's an analyst at 451 Research. He oversees the company's coverage of technology mergers and acquisitions. Before that, worked at Dow Jones for 6 years, where he wrote for VentureWire and the Wall Street Journal. Please welcome Scott in our final panel.
Hi. Well, thanks for everybody sticking around for the last panel. We will try not to get in the way of happy hour and maybe even give you something to discuss during that. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background and why they're sitting up here.
Thanks. My name is Jeremy Lavasek. I'm the Vice President for Global Automated Monetization at the Weather Company. We are an IBM business as of February this year. My responsibilities have two main areas. One, it's our global programmatic business, so running that business around the world for weather. And then two, our automated SMB sales channel. So we do a lot of business with local advertisers, and we're adding more and more automation to that channel to make it more efficient for us.
Hi, I'm Gary Keibel, and I'm an attorney. Don't run for the exits yet, please. I'm a partner at a law firm here in New York, Davis & Gilbert, and practice in the areas of digital media, technology, and privacy, and deal with these issues quite often because obviously data is driving everything, and there's a lot of legal issues when you're dealing with data, privacy issues, contractual issues, consumer-facing issues, so this is a big part of my practice these days.
My name's Mike Moreau. I run Crux Link, which is the data as a service offering from Crux. Crux is a DMP working with some of the world's leading publishers and marketers. We work with about 160 publishers, so I have a fairly unique perspective on publisher first-party data and how it's being monetized.
I'm Rachel Parkin, and I head up the programmatic and audience targeting efforts at Cafe Media, where we have properties that broadly focus on moms, millennial women, and multiculturals.
I'm Mike Smith. I work at Hearst. I work in two parts of Hearst. There's an ad technology company that Hearst acquired in 2011. I'm responsible for that. It's called Core Audience. It services the different media businesses at Hearst. And in addition, I work in the magazine division, overseeing ad ops as well as the auction systems for that division.
All right, great. I want to start by talking a little bit from the marketer's perspective and just hear a little bit from you folks about why first-party publisher data is becoming of interest to marketers since they're the end customer. Maybe, Mike Moreau, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. So, it depends on the marketer. Marketer first-party data is actually always the most valuable data, just period. We've seen that's what works the best. But not every marketer has robust first-party data. Actually, if you really think about it, most marketers have very little web traffic, so it's mostly offline data that they have to bring online. At the end of the day, they have huge gaps in their data sets, and media companies actually have a tremendous amount of data, and that's quite valuable to marketers so they can have a much more robust view of the consumer, make smarter decisions, whether it's about experience management or marketing. It just gives them a much more complete view of the user. That's really the perspective of the marketers. Generalizing, it varies a lot category by category, but generally that's a true statement.
All right. And so given that, let's talk a little bit about how publishers who want to capitalize on that, how do you go about starting to assess the value of your data? Jeremy, why don't you start?
Sure. So Michael's right. Marketers want their advertising to be successful. There's lots of media that they can buy out in the world, but they know they're going to have more success if they target that media at the right consumers and audience. And that's where publishers are a key partner in all this, right? Because our entire reason for being is to attract eyeballs to our properties, right? And if we are, managing our systems and our legal processes and our technology and all of those things correctly, publishers can be an incredible resource for really accurate, high-quality audience data. And in the case of weather, we actually have some unique data sets as well, which a lot of other publishers have too. Things like location, things like weather data. So using all of these tools, all of these data sets in the right way can generate a lot of value for publishers. And I think ultimately that's why marketers are interested in the conversation.
So what's the first step in getting marketers to value your data specifically? Rachel, why don't you take that one?
I think as a publisher, it's really important to be a master of one versus a jack of all trades, and really focus in on what's endemic to the publisher and what's unique to us, where we're in a position to best serve and deliver that type of audience versus what might be out there in a third-party universe or that the marketer has themselves. So for us, that's really age of kid, gender, and age of our site visitor, as well as Latinas, and knowing exactly what goes into our content. Just to give you an example, in the baby universe, if you read an article that's about how to cure morning sickness, then this woman, she's very likely to be pregnant, right? And that's basically being in market for 18 years of baby and children products to come into the future. If you read an article about 10 things only a pregnant woman would appreciate, then that's probably somebody who's pregnant, but maybe not. Could be people who were pregnant in the past. If you read an article about the royal baby, then this is somebody who could just be interested in royal baby news in general. And so as a publisher, we're going through, our editorial team is actually classifying every piece of content there in terms of how likely is that to get us closest to the intent. And so we're really, really hyper-focused on getting it right for the audiences that are endemic to us. So I think it's a great example of a case, especially where a publisher is going to know that much more beyond what somebody might say contextually. Well, I see every article has the word baby or pregnant in it.
And Mike Smith, how does the value start to change once you're bringing offline content and maybe even offline data into digital?
Well, our company's sales team is principally focused on selling branded content. They sell very large volumes of display advertising, but increasingly machines are most certainly servicing the fulfillment of the sales of display, and very often and increasingly so actually selling it to self-service advertisers. And so the content development as relates to our sales development is a very robust part of our business. And then the comments made earlier by my co-panelists with regard to data, our DMP, critically important to us. Building audience segments, as Rachel just described, critically important to the sale of branded content, the sale of display media. And that's being developed at scale across Hearst.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that, on how first-party data is really driving the media sales process, and how the role of first-party data has changed in that process?
Sure, I'm happy to. So our Chief Technology Officer, one of his important early moves was to build a data science department. So we have data scientists that work on analyzing our data. We have experts that collect our data. So we have a very robust capability there. And how does that get deployed into media sales? Well, it's used, it being our data assets, to forecast availability between dates certain of the kinds of audience segments that Rachel described. That data is used to target those folks, and that data is used to do attribution reporting during and after campaigns as part of a campaign wrap-up, as part of a resale, upsale. So data is used pervasively throughout the sales process, from pre-sales to post-sales to renewal.
So, Gary, given that role that data is playing, as publishers get more active in taking control of their data, what are some of the common pitfalls that they're running into, particularly from a privacy standpoint?
Sure. I mean, whenever you're dealing with any sort of data set that you want to use, you have to analyze what were the privacy disclosures that were made to the consumers prior to collecting that data. And generally, when we make disclosures to consumers, we talk about treating personal data very different than non-personal data. So it's possible that the disclosures that were made to a consumer said, we won't use your personal data for any of these reasons. We'll use personal data for a limited set of purposes, but non-personal information we may use for retargeting and behavioral advertising and other reasons. But this is sort of a new area to use the personal data for either retargeting itself or for matching projects or lookalike projects. So I've dealt with a lot of clients that have to go back and look at those privacy policy disclosures and think, are we allowed to do this current project? And if not, then we need to update our policies so that we are able to engage in this practice.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to add one point on that, is that the definition of first-party data, as the panel's kind of addressed, which is correct, is mostly it's about audiences, right? So who are people, what are their habits, where do they live, that kind of thing. At Weather, we also try and be creative about the idea, so we use weather data and location data. These are first-party data sets that we control. We don't own them. We don't own the weather. Some people like to think. We tried it, but it didn't work out. But part of the reason for doing that is some of the legal aspects that Gary mentioned, right? It's challenging as a publisher to make sure that you are fully disclosed and above board with your users, because they're the most important asset that you have. So you can't violate any of that trust. But if you get creative and start looking at data in interesting ways, we look at how consumers behave during certain weather conditions. That's actually valuable to a marketer, and you might actually use that in a media buy, right? So audience data, super important. It's also a core part of what we do, but we're trying to expand the definition of what first-party data can mean for publishers.
Yeah, and I'd add to that. I mean, it really makes a difference what you do with the data. I mean, obviously, you take someone's email address and you target them based on that personal information is very different than taking the attributes and turning it into a segment, which can be used. And then you really have to look specifically at different services and platforms that you're using. Sometimes you will actually share the personal information with another party to do a match for you. Other times you're going to do some lookalike modeling or do something different. And so each different project may have different issues when it comes to your privacy disclosures. And there are ways to get around it. As Jeremy said, you can be creative in the ways you look at your data and in the way you handle it. So if you had unfortunately made a disclosure years ago that said, we'll never let some other party touch our personal data, well, then maybe you can yourself do some kind of a match with a project and then give a segment to somebody else, as opposed to turning over your data to a third-party matching company or uploading it to a platform to do the matching.
Are the most common pitfalls around personal data, or are there some that are more around anonymous data and sharing cookie level data and that sort of thing?
It's a bit easier on the non-personal front. Now, granted, you have self-regulatory guidelines for behavioral advertising and the Digital Advertising Alliance principles, but those are, even though they've only been around a few years, are a little more mature, and people are used to dealing with it. People are just not used to looking at this issue with the first-party data, and sometimes if you go to your in-house counsel, they'll start to sweat when you start talking about using the data in this way. But again, there are ways around it. It's just a bit newer, and people aren't comfortable with all the solutions yet, but there are solutions.
Well, so far, most of the discussion has been around how data is tied to media sales, but let's talk a little bit about what's the opportunity to sort of unbundle that and for publishers to get into selling their first-party data on its own. I don't know if you're aware, Mike Moreau, but there's actually a business being built around just that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's very real. At Crux, we had one person working on that part of the business a year ago, and we now have a team of 15. And it's happening in a big way. As we get into new use cases that are far beyond media, there are a lot more buyers of data out there. So you're right. In the past, it's always been tied to media. I think that's what most publishers understand. They have a better framework for valuing that data when it's tied to media. They just understand the media CPMs, but that's not necessarily what buyers are looking for. They have other use cases for that data. They want it to be decoupled. They want to be able to do deep analysis. There's so much that marketers want to do with data beyond just targeting a simple segment for an ad campaign. But there's a lot of education that still has to happen on both sides of the equation. There's just, you asked a really good question earlier about the value of data. And that's actually one of the biggest barriers in the market today. I think marketers undervalue publisher data, and I think publishers are totally unrealistic in their expectations for what that data is worth. So there's a real divide right now in the market.
What are some of the interesting use cases that you're seeing beyond media?
Oh, I mean, there are various Internet of Things use cases that we're seeing right now. Certainly experience management in a big way. So one of our clients, who I can talk about this publicly because they've done a case study and it's on our site, but Peugeot, they use various data sets to be able to inform the exact experience for a consumer, even if it's the first time that consumer has come to their site. And think about the value of a car in that transaction. If you have a 30% increase in conversions, what happens to your top line? I mean, there are very meaningful use cases, and I've actually heard of several with the weather companies' data out there that go far beyond advertising too. We don't work together, but I've just heard these in the market. So there are a lot of marketers right now.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, no, really. There are a lot of really cool things emerging right now. Experience management is the most frequent one that I see, but there are a lot of other things bubbling up right now.
Rachel, as a publisher, is this an immediate opportunity, something on the back burner? How do you guys see it?
It's definitely something that we're open to. I think media, if you think about it, it's really inventory. So it's easy to put that in the programmatic space because if you don't sell an impression, it has no value to you. Data is an asset. And so for us, that's really about value creation and to some extent protection. So it's a little bit of a different animal, as Mike says, as you start to think about what's that value and how we put it out in the universe. I think there's a lot of potential for there to be really a private marketplace for data in the same sense that we're setting up private marketplaces for media today, where we're really starting with a small number of larger partners that we already work with directly, that we already work with on a programmatic basis, where they express interest and really appreciate the value of what we bring to the table from a data perspective, and almost gives us the chance to have that dialogue where we know what they're looking for, what the goals are. We can work with them to refine and make sure over the course of how they're using that, is that meeting their needs? How can we keep refining that audience so they drive more conversions or whatever the goal may have you? So I think it's very much about approaching it and that same one-to-one relationship in terms of creating the most opportunity there.
And now I know Core Audience has done quite a bit here as well. So maybe same question to you. What's the opportunity, sort of immediate and forward-looking, to divide data from media and generate value that way?
We're not quite sure. We don't sell our data unbundled. Selling data in the media business is I think, and I've experienced, it's a complicated thing. I mean, when Crux first went to market with AdCentry, right, the pitch is, and I think it's a great product and a great company, don't let other people steal your data. And that sounds, on the surface, horrifying, right? And so, similarly, to be the person at a media company, especially a big media company with a lot of stakeholders, who's leading an effort to sell the data. It's complicated. People feel like you're selling the crown jewels, you're selling something that maybe shouldn't be sold. So at the company that I worked for before Hearst, We actually did unbundle a smaller company in terms of the number of stakeholders. We did unbundle and sell the data, and then you have to prepare yourself for the long, true value, and the long road to material revenue. Because like most things, they start off modestly, and then if you work at it over time, it becomes something of consequence, which indeed it's become. So at Hearst, we're considering it. At Core Audience, we're considering it. But Core Audience is an ad tech company that works in the service of the media divisions at Hearst, which are principally the newspaper company, the magazine company, and the television company. So it's their data. So we could not, as an ad tech company owned by Hearst, but in the service of those enterprises, in the service of those publishers, we could not sell their data independently of them. They'd need to agree to it. So we're gonna propose a series of somethings, and then they could consider that and decide.
So, sort of an open question for anybody that wants to take it, but do you see that becoming for most publishers a core pillar of the revenue, or is it still always going to be media sales is just overwhelming majority?
I'll take a shot to start. So I think the opportunity around data is big, but I think what a lot of other folks on the panel said is there's a lot of risk in it. It's a very immature market today. As Michael described, there's kind of wild variation between publishers and marketers as to what the value of all this is. And there's big strategic questions around it as well, especially whether we think about weather data and location data. In some sense, as a publisher, really mastering your data and finding insights that you can help monetize your media becomes your special sauce, so to speak, right? So you're kind of asking the strategic question, which I think Mike was hinting at, of are you willing to sell your special sauce, right? And that's a tough question. So I think there's an opportunity, but it's going to take a long time to really get to a point where I think any publisher here would say that this is a huge, huge part of the revenue stream.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I totally agree about the risk. That's why, one of the biggest areas that we've invested in is actually building on data centry, and we focus very much on data governance. We actually have something called Trust and Verify as part of Link. It's the big differentiator to actually protect data and be able to have visibility into its use when it leaves your four walls. But to be clear, I completely understand why publishers would be concerned. The reason why I think we're seeing major publishers give this a very, very hard look in selling their data and decoupling it is what other large new revenue streams are there out there? Obviously native has been incredibly helpful, programmatic as well. But at the end of the day, if you look at the digital revenue for many of the leading publishers out there, it's actually declining. And so data is an opportunity to actually generate incremental revenue and if media is the biggest concern, we do see a lot of publishers locking up much larger media commitments with strategic partners and strategic marketers where they say, you can have restricted access to my data, but only if you buy more media. At the end of the day, I just don't think there's a cookie cutter approach that works, but to be crystal clear, I completely understand the concerns around data leakage and data protection. There's a lot of work left to be done on that in the industry.
I think also the purpose for which the data is sold makes a very big difference. If you're selling data for retargeting purposes, that's a much more sensitive use. Whereas if it's being sold for some enhanced attribution purposes or for market research, then it's less sensitive. And market research folks are always looking for new data sources, and that's not as regulated of a use of the data.
Does more sensitive often translate into more valuable, though?
True. Yes. Along with the more value become more legal issues and considerations to deal with.
Do you think that has an impact on what Mike was speaking of earlier, the gap in valuation of the buyer and seller of the data?
Yeah, of course, a buyer is going to want, the most valuable data. As Mike said, the crown jewels. They really want that good stuff. But then you, as the seller, need to consider, am I able to sell this? Am I able to sell it for the particular use that you plan on doing with the data? So of course, there's a lot of back and forth in that negotiation.
And correct me if I'm wrong, in that deal, Gary, the buyer is not taking any of the legal risk, right? They're buying the data from the publisher. Still, the person who sources the data has all the legal risk.
Correct.
So that sensitive data, although valuable, also comes with a lot of risk.
Correct. If I'm the buyer, I'm representing the buyer, I'm saying, seller, it's your responsibility to tell me that not only have you collected this data properly, but you're allowed to sell it to me for my intended use. So really the risk is all with the seller, which is why, as Mike said and as others have said, people get nervous when they talk about selling that data. It's not just, it's the crown jewels, but also the legal concerns and the liability that can come when you pass it off to another party for them to use it however they'd like.
One topic I'd like to touch on is sort of the role technology plays in all this, and whether we're talking about selling the data directly or just using it to bolster media sales. Is most of the publisher community where they need to be in terms of understanding what technology is available, what's right to use, and what are just generally best practices?
I have a point of view on it. It varies wildly. Yeah, some publishers are super sophisticated, absolutely using the right technology. They have the right stack in place. And then there are many who don't. But you could say the same thing about the marketer side. I don't think the one is ahead of the other. I think it just varies very, very much from company to company. But no, there's some smart publishers out there making really, really good decisions.
Anybody else? Rachel, you want to chime in on that?
I mean, I can't speak for everybody. I think there's definitely, if you go down the data path, there's a commitment from a publisher side. If you're doing it in-house or getting a DMP with the data science team, and being really rigorous about how you approach that so that you are getting to something that is a great product that works and is right for the publisher and the advertiser. I mean, certainly, I think as you talk about that value piece and how do we bridge the gap between what the marketer's perception of the value is and the publisher's perception of the value, we're fighting as a publisher a bit of an uphill battle too, because you talk about all of the third-party data that's out there and it seems very cheap and very accessible, but the question is, does it work? Even for something as basic as demographics, we as publishers are held to a much higher standard, even measuring that with Nielsen, OCR, DAR, that we have higher publisher benchmarks that we have to meet than any third-party data vendor. And so I think even starting almost baby steps to close that gap in terms of let's back our PMP with publisher first-party data so we can prove out to you it works better than the third-party data. Or do audience extension using our publisher data. So there are all these steps almost in between where once you have the technology in place, there's an opportunity for us as the publisher to prove out that value so we can come up with a valuation that makes sense for both sides of the coin.
All right. And then I just want to go down the line here and just everybody give a recommendation. What's something you see that publishers could be doing that many aren't to just get more value out of their data?
That's a tough one. I think of it more as are you taking the right process in this, right? So I think there's kind of an evaluation phase of what do you have, how could it be valuable. I think the technology piece is a huge portion of that, right? Because once you understand what you have, how do you activate it, actually bring it to market and use it. And then ultimately, I think the last piece is thinking about the business models around all of this, right? So when we talk about gaps between marketers from you in a business context, right? What is it worth from a revenue point of view? Are there legal risks? So I don't know the answer for every publisher, but it feels like if you follow some of those steps, you might come to some sort of answer.
And I would think, think about maybe an audit trail of your data, before you engage in a project. Think about where did you first acquire the data? What disclosures were made in connection with that data? Now, where is it going? And what is the use that you're going to authorize? And, just again, it's planning in advance to make sure that's all lined up properly, because you don't want to enter into a deal and make a commitment to another party and then realize that you didn't have permission to do so, or as Jeremy points out, that buyer is going to expect you to be responsible for things that you didn't think you were going to be liable for in the first place. So get that plan in order and be able to defend that audit trail of the data?
Yeah, I just encourage much tighter relationships with advertisers and marketers. Specifically, what I mean by that is I would have conversations with them about the data they're buying today, whether it's from other publishers for media targeting, if it's third-party data. Understand what else they're buying outside of your site, because marketers often don't understand the breadth of data that a publisher has. If you have the opportunity to replace the data that's being purchased elsewhere, it'll lead to more media investment on your site. And just one small anecdote, a small data point, we see on average across the Crux client base 40% better performance from publisher first-party data than from third-party data. One thing that I've learned about marketers, if it works, they'll buy it and they'll come back more and more. So focusing on what they're already buying and giving them something that performs better, I think will yield far better results for publishers.
I definitely think it's focus. So figuring out as a publisher, what are those one or two things that you can be uniquely great at, and just focusing on what you need to do to be great at those. You don't have to have everything. If it's not in your wheelhouse, just say no when somebody comes to you and says, can you give me data to do X? And it's just focus on what are those things that you uniquely bring to the table as a publisher. And I agree with Mike, it's all about communication and having a dialogue. It's not that we as publishers are just pushing something out there into the ether and people are going to buy it. It's very much about curating that product and selling it like any other hands-on traditional direct sold deal.
My suggestion would be that publishers continue to hire really intelligent, experienced people who understand data science, the applicability of data science to media. I think it's the marketplace is such that publishers can hire folks. Like we're the three of us, I guess, are the publishers on the panel. So, hiring someone like Jeremy, someone like Rachel, they have incredible credentials. If you were to go look at their LinkedIn profiles, you'd know what I mean. In the marketplace, Terry Kawaja's conferences today, the Lumascape, the DMS, and the theme of the conference is, what happens in marketplace is that the intermediaries start to get pushed out to the edges, the buy and the sell side. So more marketers are hiring those folks, more publishers are hiring those folks. You see it all the time. You see, the gentleman from Pubmatic went to Conde. There are lots of examples of that with an increase in incidence of that. And I think that's going to continue. And so more tech will exist on literally the publisher and the marketer sides. And, everyone contributes value. But my suggestion would be to accelerate the pace of hiring people like that.
Great. Do we have time for
Yes,
questions?
we do. Any questions from the audience? Yep.
Hi, I'm Michael Logan from BidSelect. Question is for Jeremy. Good to see you, Jeremy.
Hey.
I think you're unique in really against most publishers, but certainly against the folks on the panel, in that Weather Company is now part of IBM. So the data that you guys are sitting on is now being utilized for far greater issues or far greater purposes than just media. Can you elaborate on how your data is now used for IBM for things outside of media, for maybe the Internet of Things?
I really wish Gary was our internal counsel so he could advise me how to answer sensitive questions like this. But sure, I mean, listen, I think the generic answer I can sort of give you here is that we've made big bets on data at Weather, right? That's we've been pretty loud in the marketplace over the last few years about weather affecting your life. And even the Weather Company, outside of the media business, has always had a B2B business where we actually do sell weather data to airlines, for example, or insurance companies. So folks like that who have absolutely nothing to do with media buy our weather data. I think IBM's interested in that, and I think they're a company that the big areas of interest for them are certainly data, things like artificial intelligence, Watson, which I think kind of ties with, what we're talking about here, right? Having the data and then processing it through a really, really powerful piece of technology to get insights out of it. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's probably the best I can do here, but they like the data, they think it's impactful, and they have plans to make it much bigger.
Let me extend that question a little bit, because even before IBM, you had, weather companies sort of had a unique proprietary data set, weather. And it becomes, as we start moving away from the weather company towards a Hearst or a Cafe Media, or a lot of the companies that Crux works with on the publisher side, the challenge is that you had a programmatic ad ecosystem where media buyers were able to find your audience much cheaper at other places. And the imbalance in the market was that media buyers seemed often to know more about your own audience than a lot of the publishers did, or at least knew a lot more, had more data at hand about the audience. Couple that with the fact that you've got platforms like Google and Facebook in particular, that can now track those people across platforms and much more effectively, and have very granular data about those users. So the promise of first-party data from publishers was always that now we can bring something unique to the marketplace. Weather company could always do that. We had weather. We had something that a marketer probably couldn't get and other publishers couldn't get. But I'm curious that when we start moving into publishers like Hearst or Cafe Media, somewhat more general publishers, how are you effectively competing with the data that's already in the market, in the exchanges, and these platforms that have their own kind of proprietary data? Because that was the promise of first-party data, that you should know your audiences better than anybody. And I'm curious how you're actually competing in that market now, where you're doing it effectively.
I mean, for us, we really just focus on the things that we bring to the market that are unique. And again, coming back to baby and age of child as an example, that's not data that any third party really accurately or soundly has. It's pretty unique and unique to us, and we're very hyper-focused on mining that in a way that we can surface up and say, this is a pregnant woman, this is a woman with a child of the ages between 3 and 5. And so it's being very focused on what is unique about the data that we have in the marketplace. So
in that case, you even know week to week where they are at the stage of their pregnancy, and you can target that in a way that nobody else can, right?
I mean, certainly we know every piece of content that they're reading and what that says, and people will come in and give us the age of their child and what month are they going to be born in, but it is taking every piece that we know about a user and really laser focusing on just those couple of audience segments that we're very, very good at. If someone comes to me and says, can you tell me if this person's in market for a car? I probably am not the best person to give them data on who's in market for a car. There are great sources out there. So we just try to focus on the things that are very unique to us and that there's not great data on otherwise. Being age of child and Latino, obviously we have a Spanish language site, so that's again something that isn't very well measured out there in the universe.
Yep. So as a follow-up, do you break out then, because you mentioned two things. Sorry. Do you break out, since you mentioned two things, one, you can see what a user who comes to your site, you can see 7 articles they read over the course of 10 days, and they all have to do with being pregnant. Do you break that out as a targeting segment versus a registered user who's come in and explicitly told you who they are, where they are in their pregnancy, and shared all that information? Do you break those out, price them differently?
We're going to definitely take everything together and make the best segment in terms of that focus for all of our advertisers. So we're going to take every piece of information we have and pull that together into the best possible segment.
Anybody else? Any other questions?
Cesar Brea with Foresight Partners. So one thing I haven't heard in this conversation is a discussion of a currency, of lift over control, of ROI on data, right? If I'm a marketer, I'm thinking, okay, I have the ability to go out and buy this audience, I can guess at it contextually. I can use some third-party data to try to target these people. If I come to a publisher and I ask you, what's your value proposition, and you say, well, we've got first-party data, that'll really help you target this audience effectively, you should be able to see lift-over control, go up by some magnitude or something like that. I wonder if you could comment on how maybe the degree to which the ability of publishers to leverage first-party data sets that they control is partly a function of needing to get to some sort of common currency for doing so, and beginning to sort of talk more explicitly in that language. I could just be reacting to the fact that we haven't, discussed that explicitly in this panel, and it's obviously part of any pitch you'd make. But I wonder if you could talk about the role of that and being able to say, look, for these 3 use cases, Rachel, for example, for mothers with kids under 3, we can typically achieve liftover control of X compared with your alternatives. I wonder if you could comment on how heavily you rely on that as part of your pitch to try to make the best use of the data sets you guys control.
I think the proof's always in the pudding. I mean, any publisher, we're willing to say, to any data, give us a test, and we're going to prove that it works out. And so each one of these cases is going to be specific to every advertiser and what we ran, but we're always measuring things and looking at what that lift is, be it brand lift or sales lift, and putting the proof in the pudding. And even if somebody's running in a programmatic environment and they're using our audiences or segments, we want that feedback from our advertiser and marketer too, in terms of what's the ROI and the performance and how are we doing versus everybody else, because that's the best information and the best selling point is what it's actually doing for the end game. So we certainly are behind that goal and working to make sure people understand that and know it.
It's one comment. I'm glad you asked that question, because as much as data is valuable and useful, it can also be misused. And I think that's another reason for publishers to, at least before they go and resell their data, be a little bit careful with that, because the last thing you want is someone misusing your data and then going around and telling the rest of the market that it doesn't work. Because we know that certain traits that might be collected in the cafe media environment or the Hearst environment or the weather environment, data also performs in context. Context matters. Premium environments matter. So just ripping that data out and assuming it's going to work exactly the same way as you buy across an open exchange, I think is a fallacy. And I think that's a big risk for publishers and buyers, by the way, and marketers who won't see the results they expect. So it's kind of another argument for being really thoughtful about controlling data and the right way to partner on it.
Yeah, and I think that's why peer-to-peer connections are so important, because you have that dialogue back and forth. I mean, we see it all the time. The marketers that are willing to share KPIs, they won't necessarily share ROI, but they will tell you how you're performing against others. It gives you the opportunity to change the rules of the segment and modify the data and experiment and find ways to make that data work. So if you just buy data blindly through an exchange, you don't have that sort of visibility. But I am finding that more and more marketers and publishers are partnering in that way to find the right data that works in the open environment.
Do we have time for more? Or
Actually, I have one wrap question, sort of circle back to where we started today, where we had a panel of media buyers, all of whom insisted, give us the right audience, give us the right premium inventory, we don't mind paying a lot for it. And I sort of want to go back to Michael Moreau's point from Crux that there's some sort of disconnect between the way that marketers are valuing the data and the way you think it should be valued. Are you seeing, where are we in terms of the market, in terms of whether you think as publishers you're seeing the value that you really think your audience and your data deserves? Marketers seem to think that they're more than willing to pay a premium price for getting the right audience and getting the right placement and getting the right environment. But on your end, are you seeing that?
I'll stick with what I said earlier. I think it's still very early. There's big gaps, and it's also interesting. I think there's the whole conversation about data and is it used properly, and then there's a big question around business models. So is your data being sold peer to peer, as you suggest? Are there kind of like third-party resellers in there that might be adding margin, which could sound familiar to publishers if you remember sort of the bad old days of ad networks and things like that, of someone taking your data, adding a margin to it, and then marking it up for a marketer, because that would feel expensive to a marketer and less valuable to a publisher. So you have to watch out for things like that. And I think it's still very early.
Well, and I think a premium, it depends on what the premium is on. So if you're comparing it to just like open exchange buying, willing to pay a premium on top of that, well, that's pretty easy. If it's a premium compared to third-party data, pretty easy again. But that baseline from a publisher's perspective is probably significantly different. It's more like, what are their sales teams selling directly? What are they getting for media plus data together when their sales teams go out and articulate the value? I think that causes the divide. I think both sides are right. They're just not looking at the problem through the same lens.
Well, with that, we do need to wrap. Thank you all very much. Scott, panel, thank you very much for bringing us around. We are going to wrap. We appreciate all of you staying so long through the end of the day, and I want to